you actually wrote an article recently revolving around single sexuality. I would love for you to just start before we kind of jump into the article, maybe just a broad definition. What is single sexuality?
Yes. So I think like typically the church only talks about sex and sexuality within the context of marriage, right? Because that's kind of how God designed it to be. But we like never really stop being sexual people. It's not a light switch that we can turn on and off. Like when you're married and get a wedding ring on your finger, and all of a sudden you are sexual. But before that, you weren't, right? Like it's something that's a part of how God wired our bodies, even from the beginning, right? And so it's pretty much just understanding that part of yourself, even as a single person, before you get married, so that it doesn't feel like this hard shift of I'm turning on this light switch and now I'm a sexual person all of a sudden, and then that feels confusing.
Yeah, yeah. What inspired you to write this kind of article?
Yeah, well, I noticed that a lot of single people that I worked with, and even a lot of married people that I work with, just kind of had problems engaging sexuality, right? Like married couples coming in with sexual issues, noticed that they had problems kind of turning that light switch on,
Mm.
right? Or even like individuals that I worked with, singles that I worked with, who like really struggle with a lot of shame around their sexual identity, just because it's never been talked about. It's never been like understood, at least within a religious and spiritual context, of what do we do with the sexual part of ourself and how does that impact our sexual functioning later on in life.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. Totally. So was this article kind of written to people who are single, who aren't married yet and are struggling with that? Or is it kind of written also to people who maybe are and are having trouble with that little switch that we have mentally around sexuality? Who is this article for?
Yeah, so it's definitely targeted to singles who are grappling with the idea of sexuality and how do I navigate this and what do I do with this part of myself. It's directly written for those people for sure, but I think like if there's a married person that is kind of recognizing or that's resonating with them of, okay, yeah, I do kind of have a hard time engaging sexually now because maybe that light switch is still turned off. I think there could be some benefit for them in there as well. But primarily it's for kind of the single person of like, what do I do with this part of me that's still here when I'm not married? Right? How do I
Yeah.
engage that? How do I?
Yeah, absolutely. Why do you think that the church misses such a large part of God's design, God's message around sexuality? Why do you think the church specifically often misses that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I can only speak from my experiences, right? But I think in my experience growing up in the church and kind of living within that culture, I think my perception of it is there's kind of a taboo around sex and sexuality, right? Like there's this implicit notion that if we talk to kids or young adults about sex and sexuality, then they're going to want to go have sex. And you can't have sex before you're married, right? That's against the rules. And so we just don't talk about it. So we don't put their ideas in their head, and then they don't go out and make bad life choices in regards to their sexuality, right? And so we kind of put this quiet implicit, like the unspoken rules of the church are that we don't talk about sexuality so that we're not tempting young people to go explore and figure out what that is, right?
Yeah, right. Absolutely. I remember having a conversation with our founder, Josh Spurlock, when I first kind of got started here at MCO, and we were talking kind of around sexuality and God's design of it. And he said something that has just really stuck with me, which is that if anyone should be celebrating sexuality and God's incredible design of it, it should be the church. And it's just so interesting how it's become such like a mixed signal. I can remember, I guess they call it, purity culture. I remember that when I was, in middle school and going to these like middle school lock-ins where they'd split the guys and the girls and we'd have, the sex talk or whatever it might be. And I remember, really getting it ingrained to me at that young age that my sexuality was wrong, And thankfully, I had parents and friends and people, mentors who poured into me. And so it didn't make it such a hard transition when I did go into marriage and was able to really just like take that whole new side of things on. But a lot of people don't have that, right? A lot of people, go their whole lives thinking that sex is wrong and can't separate it once they get married. And that leads to so many issues and struggles, and hard things for couples to go through, in their marriage. And so I think that that is really important to talk about. Have you, as a counselor, like encountered a lot of people who have kind of experienced that like mixed signals around sexuality within the church?
Oh my gosh, so many. So many. I think most Christians that I work with have had some experience like that, where it's like I like to think about it like a vacuum, right? Like there's this huge big empty void space in the church around talking about sex and sexuality. And I think as a result of that vacuum, like that space, that big empty space gets filled up with messages from the world that maybe aren't the healthiest around sex and sexuality, right? So there's like your friends at school, there's pornography, there's like locker room talk, right? There's all these different other voices that are speaking into the sexual part of our lives if the church isn't speaking into it. And I think we can kind of, like I talk about in the article, right? There's this one side where we completely turn that part of ourselves off if the messaging is your sexuality is bad unless you're married, right? It's like we work really, really hard to suppress those feelings and not notice those feelings and not engage with that part of ourselves at all. Um, or we flip over to the other side, right, where we're like kind of go into that rebellious mode of like, well, fine, then I'm just going to explore all of this and figure all of this out and maybe make choices that I wouldn't make otherwise, to just kind of like figure it out. And then it causes a bunch of shame and guilt later on because we're like, oh wait, I did that. How does God see me now? How is this going to impact the future of my marriage, right? And so this big void space kind of leaves room for a bit of a catch-22, I think, instead of like what you were saying, sharing God's heart and God's vision and God's intention behind sex and sexuality, right? Because he made us that way.
Right. Yeah. So, how do we practically allow God to redeem his plan for sexuality?
Yes. So I think as a single person, right, if like there's single people listening to this, I think it looks like embracing how God designed you specifically in your femininity or masculinity, right? Because that's a big aspect of your sexuality, and kind of leaning into God's design in you. And a lot of that work happens from the inside out, right? Like really diving into scriptures and discovering God's design for sexuality. There's an entire book of the Bible devoted to a sexual relationship, right? Like God made it as good and he wants us to celebrate it and enjoy it within the right context, right? Like just like there is like kind of guidelines around food, like we could eat ice cream every day all the time for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and that would taste really good and be really fun, but we would feel sick later and it wouldn't be good for our health, right? So it's thinking about like what are the guidelines that God created around sexuality and how do I incorporate that into my life without like turning that light switch off.
Yeah, yeah, you describe sexual desire in your article as the urge for intimacy, and I just thought that that was such a neat way to put it. Can you kind of expand on that? Expand on that urge for intimacy?
Yeah, that God made sexual desire in us as a good thing, right? As a way to experience connection with other people, right? Because that's kind of what that urge is. And if you're not married and there's not necessarily a healthy physical outlet for that at that time, letting that physical urge kind of be a pointer and an indicator of I'm really just desiring being close to someone, right? And how can I get that desire to be close to someone met in a way that's healthy and safe and good for me and good for the people around me, right? And so it's like a pointer, a mile marker, an indicator, right? Like our emotions are indicators, and sometimes our sexual desire can be an indicator that I just need connection, I just need closeness, and like maybe I need to go meet up with a girlfriend at a coffee shop and just like get a hug and chat for a while and like get that need for feeling connected to someone met, because it's a healthy need, it's a good need,
Right.
right? It's just getting that need met in a way that's healthy.
Right. Yeah. And so, it's natural to have those sexual desires, but you do touch a little bit on lust, and kind of the difference between that urge for intimacy and lust. How can you kind of emphasize on how you can separate the two?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's tricky, right? It can be a fine line, because your desire for intimacy, is a very human, normal, good thing inside of you, right? And the lust piece, I think, goes back to how I understand it, is going back to like this idea of wanting something that doesn't belong to you, right? And like the random stranger on the street that you thought was attractive, like thinking about them in a sexual way, like is not honoring to them, it's not honoring to God, right? It's wanting something, desiring something that doesn't really belong to you, right? And so that's kind of how I differentiate that it's this ruminating thought, or it's picturing something that maybe isn't the best or the most healthy, like that's not yours, that doesn't belong to you, and kind of how you're honoring the other person
Mm.
in the eyes
Yeah.
of God, right?
Right. Yeah. How practically, like, how do you shut that down? How do you shut down those feelings that kind of turn into thoughts?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that I like to distinguish and differentiate like feelings and thoughts, right? Like feelings happen, feelings come and go. Feelings, it's kind of like an open door to a house, right? There's guests that come in and out, and some guests stay longer than others, right? Feelings kind of work like that. Thoughts, like the word is very specific that we can take those captive, right? And so it's one thing to be able to notice and experience, like, wow, I'm feeling arousal in my body, I'm noticing that, I'm feeling that, okay, that's a natural and good thing inside of me, that's how God made me, right? But just because your body is responding that way doesn't necessarily mean that your thoughts have to go a certain direction, right? Same thing with anger. If I'm mad at someone, I can notice where I feel that anger in my body, and I can pay attention to that and like listen to that. But just because I'm feeling anger in my body doesn't mean that I'm going to have thoughts about hurting someone else, right? Like those two things are different. And so it's the same with sexuality, that you can notice that feeling of arousal in your body and like validate that this is a normal and good and healthy thing that's happening inside of me. But I'm going to really make sure that I'm taking my thoughts captive, and I'm not going in a direction with them that is going to be dishonoring to the Lord or someone else or myself, right?
Mm. Yeah, no, that's so good. Kind of to close on talking about this article, single sexuality, what encouragement would you give to someone who maybe is single right now and experiencing these things? What encouragement as a counselor would you like to give to them?
Yes. Oh my gosh. I would want to tell them that their sexuality is such a good and important part of who they are, that it is not something that needs to be turned off or ignored or like rejected inside of themselves, that it is a good thing and that it is a gift, that God gave them. God gave them to kind of celebrate their uniqueness and their femininity or masculinity, and kind of enjoy what God's given them in a way that's healthy and honoring and safe and all that good stuff, but to just like really celebrate and enjoy that part of themselves, so that if the Lord does have someone for them in the future, that can be such a joyful thing to step